Hi, and welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Christina Langell, and with me today is the Pennsylvania editor for the Center Square, Kristen Smith. Kristen, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks. So you've wrote about what polls show about how people feel about school choice in Pennsylvania. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So what's interesting about the poll is that it seemed to defy what we traditionally think of as the battle lines in the school choice debate. No matter what age group, no matter what party affiliation, no matter what region of the state, no matter, who you voted for in the 2024 election, it seems that there is majority support for programs that would give educational scholarships to students, which they could then use to, say, attend a private school or, get tutoring or other supplies to help either augment or replace the public schooling that they're getting that might be not working out well for them. And it's a really interesting survey in the fact that the Ragnar Research Group who performed it, they actually interviewed 800 people, likely voters, I should say, 800 likely voters in person and asked them 2 questions about school choice. Now, it's important to note that with polls, and this is across the board, this isn't just with Ragnar Research Group, but all of them, that with polls, the way the questions are worded make a big difference. That being said, these likely voters were asked, how would you feel? Would you support a program that lets students go to private schools and would pay their tuition? And there was support, even among identified Kamala Harris voters. At least 54% of them said that they would support it. On the higher levels, you saw 89% of Trump voters support it. When it comes to racial demographics, Black and Hispanic voters overwhelmingly approve of the idea of school choice. That's important to note because regionally speaking, school choice is also very popular in more urbanized areas, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Scranton, Reading. And that's because those are where school districts are historically struggling with resources, and we've been giving them a lot more money, and they've continued to struggle. So there's been a lot of access to other school choice programs in these regions. So it's more of a familiar concept there. And therefore, I think it's not something there's not as much explaining to do as you might have to do in other types of surveys about this issue.
So the basic education funding formula that the state recently approved has not had a lot of time to set in. Do you think that would, if they saw improvement from increased fundings in these areas, do you think that it would kind of hold true that people are still supportive of choice in general, or do you think that it's kind of a circumstance of the school conditions?
It's an interesting question because one of the arguments for school choice is that for a lot of the kids who use it, they may be low income or coming from minority households or have other socioeconomic factors that make it really hard for them to go to any other school but the one in their district. And that district is not serving their needs, whether they don't have the funds to even provide a safe learning environment, let alone actual quality teachers or even textbooks. There's just so many fundamental issues with the school buildings and the population that they're trying to serve. And so the argument there is it doesn't really matter how much money is pumped into these schools. As you said, it would take years to take effect. That's not going to help the kids there now. And so that the families who have been living with this reality, their viewpoint isn't as much to change, likely. But, if you give it 10, 20 years to play out, there may be an argument that why are we using taxpayer money to support private schools over public schools when we could use that money for public schools? Historically, Democrats, that's really where they're at on this issue. And it's an unusual position because generally we think of these things as flipped. Republicans are very much stewards of taxpayer dollars and, budget hawks and making sure that public money isn't used for purposes that they think are outside the scope of government. And Democrats their scope of government is larger. And so that they believe that we should spend more money on public education and healthcare and all these things that go to the people but are very expensive and could raise taxes. So that's always the give and take. And this in school, it's no different. Part of the reason that these districts are struggling is because they have to rely on property taxes. Property taxes are not levied the same way across districts. They're not. And again, it all depends on your tax base. So if you have a lower socioeconomic area, you're going to have a school with a lot less support. And the state is only filling in about a third to 40% of that. And then federal government's only doing about 10 to 11%. So it's really up to local property taxpayers to fill that gap. And it's not that they don't want to, it's just that they can't. And so I think it's easier, and this seems to be held and supported by the data, but for more affluent white communities outside of urban centers, they're able to wait. They're able to say, we're putting more money in now. That's where we want our money to go. And we want to give it time so that this public money that we pay money to is going to support the taxpayers who need it most. And so for them, that's why you see school choice support lower among them, although there's still about 60% who support it, at least in the short term. So you ask a really interesting question there. There's so many factors at play, but I think if it's a short-term versus long-term question, that really could change the dynamics of the situation.
So we recently did a nationwide poll about school choice, and it wasn't necessarily a top priority for people with education. I think largely because of the current upheaval of the federal government and the Department of Education. I think that's really kind of taking a lot of the oxygen out of the room. But I spoke to an analyst who said that for the people who have strong feelings about both homeschooling and school choice, like they have a lot of skin in the game, and there is a very passionate argument for them. And I think I see that reflected in this conversation and how Pennsylvania has dealt with the school choice issue. Do you think that, like, seeing that there's this overwhelming support and it's bipartisan within the people of Pennsylvania, do you think that means that there's potential for progress in the legislature maybe this year or coming soon?
I don't think so. I believe that our existing programs, which are school choice tax credits, which rely on donations from individuals and businesses in order to be used to offset tuition for low-income kids, those I think we will continue to see an expansion of, which means theoretically they will reach more children, although about half of those tax credits can't be used because there's not enough donations. So that program has its limits. Now, it used to be cutting edge. We used to lead in the country on school choice. We were one of the first states to come out with such a program, but we've just fallen so far behind. You have a lot of states that have enacted universal school choice, and that extends beyond just being able to have money to afford private school, but even you can transfer between public schools within, a geographical region within a county. There isn't a zip code tie to where you are at. So Pennsylvania is farther behind in that way. But the legislature is so closely divided that even though there is likely a majority support, although it's much slimmer in the House than it is in the Senate, even though there is support on both sides of the aisle, there is unlikely to be a vote on a more expansive school choice program because House Democrats and Governor Josh Shapiro really want to make sure that we follow the constitutional order to equalize funding, and that has to take priority over school choice, which is seen as part of a host of solutions to help our struggling education system, but certainly not the only solution or the top solution. Now, obviously, there's a lot of people who disagree with that. And I think during the pandemic, that group of people grew really large because people were fleeing public schools, whether that was a fear of the virus or anger about the restrictions and the masks and how often schools were closed. So that was really pushing people towards charter schools, towards homeschooling, towards private schools. And you saw a lot of skyrocketing of enrollment across all of those areas. And it really seems to be holding now. And of course, the national attention on the Department of Education being dismantled and this really populist notion of distrust and fear in what the Department of Education is instilling into public schools, that's still prevalent. But the tide, even according to our polling at the Center Square, the tide is shifting towards a lot of uncertainty about it. We have another couple of years until a lot of this cycles through, kind of like many other education policies. So will that pendulum swing back towards, we do need federal oversight of education. We do need to spend more money on public education, and there has to be more of a balance? Or will some kind of school choice proliferate? It's hard to say. It all depends on legislative breakdowns, how many Republicans, how many Democrats. It always comes back to that. In Pennsylvania, we have new redistricting. We are becoming more purple by the day, so that this issue, which is often a party line issue, is unlikely to get resolved this year or even next, I would argue.
We will absolutely be keeping up with this story at centersquare.com.